The first to try and cheat him in the game of numbers disappeared, leaving behind only a single red chess piece. This act established an ironclad rule, a principle that became the foundation of his empire. This is the story of why, in Bumpy Johnson's world, internal betrayal was a mistake no one would make twice. In the autumn of 1936, Harlem was a kingdom in the making, emerging from the ashes of a brutal war against mobster Dutch Schultz. In the power vacuum, Bumpy Johnson emerged as the unifying force. But peace was fragile and the task ahead was monumental, transforming a chaotic ecosystem of hundreds of independent numbers bankers into a single, cohesive empire. Trust was the most valuable and rare currency. It was at this crucial moment that Reggie Thorne, a brilliant but bitter accountant, decided to test his new king. Bumpy had plucked Reggie from obscurity and placed him at the financial heart of his nascent empire. Reggie, who had seen rivers of money flow through his hands, became convinced that he was smarter than the warring king who employed him. He developed a double ledger system and began to embezzle a small percentage. Reggie's fatal mistake wasn't greed, but intellectual arrogance. He believed Bumpy was just a man of muscles, incapable of understanding his art. The historical context of the late 1930s was one of precarious reconstruction. The Great Depression still cast its long shadow over Harlem. The numbers game wasn't just an addiction. It was a mechanism for economic survival for the entire community. Bumpy Johnson, with the tacit support of Lucky Luciano, was tasked with transforming this artisanal industry into a criminal corporation. This required creating systems, imposing rules, and above all, ensuring that the system was fair. His men needed to believe that loyalty would be rewarded. Reggie Thorne's betrayal, coming from the epicenter of the operation, was therefore not just a robbery. It was a direct attack on the foundation of Bumpy's new kingdom, an existential threat to his newly acquired authority. If word spread that the king could be deceived by his own treasurers, trust would evaporate and the empire would disintegrate into chaos. Bumpy Johnson's psychological persona at that time was that of a nation builder. He was a visionary who saw the potential of a unified Harlem. His mind, sharpened by years of reading in prison and playing chess, was his primary tool for governance. He was obsessively meticulous. Unlike the stereotype of the impulsive gangster, Bumpy spent hours every night personally analyzing books, daily reports, betting patterns. He had a photographic memory for numbers and an almost supernatural intuition for anomalies. His lieutenants often mistook this attention to detail for paranoia, but in reality it was strategic discipline. He had studied the fall of empires and knew that they rarely fall because of external attacks. They rot from the inside out. The betrayal of a trusted man like Reggie was his greatest fear, and the challenge he knew he needed to face decisively. Bumpy's moral code valued loyalty above all other virtues. He could forgive mistakes, but not deliberate betrayal. For Bumpy, loyalty was a sacred pact. He offered his men protection, opportunity, and a fair share of the profits. In return, he demanded absolute loyalty. Breaking that pact was the ultimate sin. Reggie Thorne was no stranger. He was someone Bumpy had uplifted, someone he had trusted. Reggie's betrayal was therefore deeply personal, an act of ingratitude that violated the most fundamental code in Bumpy's universe. The response could not be merely punitive. It had to be a statement, one that established the sanctity of loyalty as the first and most important commandment of his new kingdom. Bumpy's intelligence shone through in his methodical approach. He didn't confront Reggie the moment he sensed the first suspicion. Instead, he began his own secret investigation. For weeks he operated on two levels. Publicly, he treated Reggie with the same confidence. Privately, he began cross-referencing the numbers in Reggie's books with the raw reports from his most trusted district controllers. He pieced together a complex puzzle, comparing the stated totals with the actual revenues. It was an exhaustive exercise in patience and intellectual rigor. Bumpy was hunting in his own backyard, using his mind as a weapon to track prey that had no idea it was being hunted. This methodical approach was the hallmark of his strategic genius. Reggie Thorne's fatal mistake was intellectual underestimation. He looked at Bumpy and saw an ex-convict, a man of the streets, and assumed that his own education and skill with numbers made him superior. He couldn't conceive that Bumpy, a man without accounting training, could decipher his sophisticated scheme. Reggie committed the sin of arrogance. He didn't understand that Bumpy's intelligence didn't come from books, but from survival. Bumpy had a PhD in human nature. He knew that greed leaves a trail and that arrogance always makes mistakes. Reggie, in his blind confidence, became careless, leaving small discrepancies that, to the untrained eye, were nothing, but to Bumpy were the loose thread that would unravel his entire plan. The trap for Reggie wasn't a dark alley, but a silent accounting room. Bumpy summoned him to a late-night meeting in the operations main office under the pretext of reviewing projections for the coming year. The atmosphere was sterile and silent, lit only by a single desk lamp. On the table, instead of projections, Bumpy had spread out the two versions of the accounting books, the false ones Reggie presented and the true ones Bumpy had reconstructed. There were no armed men, no threats. The weapon that night was the truth. The confrontation was purely intellectual, which made it all the more terrifying for Reggie. Bumpy invited him to sit down and, with deadly calm, began to point out the discrepancies, one by one, dismantling Reggie's web of lies with cold, relentless logic. The irreversibility of the moment set in when Bumpy reached the last page and looked at Reggie. There was no anger in his eyes, only cold disappointment. "You underestimated me, Reggie," Bumpy said, his voice a whisper. "You thought I was just another street thug who couldn't read, but I read everything. I read every penny you stole. And I read you." Reggie crumbled. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His brilliant mind, which he considered his greatest weapon, had been completely outwitted. He was naked, exposed, his betrayal dissected on the table. The tension in the room was unbearable. There would be no negotiation, no second chance. Reggie had committed the only unforgivable sin. Reggie's arrogance was his downfall. He saw himself as a silent partner and felt he deserved more. This self-importance prevented him from seeing the real danger. The closed environment of the office became a chamber of psychological torture. Every scrap of paper on the desk was proof of Reggie's guilt. Every pause in Bumpy's calm speech felt like an eternity. Reggie was forced to confront not only the evidence of his crime, but the magnitude of his stupidity. He hadn't been caught by an informant or by luck. He had been caught by the superior mind of the man he had scorned. This intellectual humiliation was, in many ways, worse than the prospect of physical violence. Bumpy wasn't just punishing a thief, he was destroying the ego of a man who considered himself untouchable. The lesson taught in that room was clear. Nothing is hidden from the king. Bumpy's omnipresence wasn't physical, but mental. Reggie's story would become the foundational story of Bumpy's regime, ensuring that, although Bumpy wasn't always watching, his intelligence was. The turning point was Bumpy's silence after exposing the betrayal. He didn't shout. He simply leaned back in his chair and watched Reggie disintegrate. It was in that silence that Bumpy's control became absolute. He gave Reggie space to contemplate the abyss. The power wasn't in throwing a punch, but in forcing a man to confront the totality of his wrongdoing. When Reggie finally began to plead, to cry, to offer to return the money, Bumpy simply shook his head. "It's not about the money, Reggie. It never was." At that moment, Reggie understood that he had been judged and condemned in a court of law, where he didn't even know he was a defendant. The direct consequence of Reggie's mistake was simple, final, and absolute. He disappeared. He walked out of that room and was never seen again, a vanishing so clean that it left no room for speculation inside the organization. There were no rumors of escape, no whispered sightings, no hope of return. Reggie was erased from the operational reality of Bumpy Johnson's empire in a single movement. Yet even in this act of removal, Bumpy demonstrated a calculated form of control. Reggie's family was not abandoned. They received a generous pension, accompanied by the carefully worded explanation that he had been forced to leave town. This gesture served two purposes simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared as compassion, reinforcing the idea that punishment was directed at betrayal, not bloodlines. Beneath that surface, however, it functioned as a chilling warning. Everyone understood that Bumpy decided not only who disappeared, but who was allowed to continue living comfortably afterward. Mercy, like violence, was entirely at his discretion. This balance of care and threat reinforced his authority more effectively than brutality alone ever could. While Reggie's disappearance resolved the immediate problem, it was the symbolic consequence that transformed the incident into legend. The following day, when employees returned to the financial office, they found Reggie's desk empty, untouched, and silent. Sitting at its center was a single object, a chess piece from an expensive set, carefully placed and impossible to ignore. It was a pawn, carved from red stone. No note accompanied it. None was necessary. The symbolism was immediate and multi-layered. Red evoked blood, debt, and consequence, binding the idea of betrayal to inevitability. The pawn carried an even sharper message. Reggie had believed himself to be a player, someone clever enough to manipulate the system for personal gain. The pawn corrected that illusion. It stated with ruthless clarity that he had always been expendable. In the hierarchy of Bumpy Johnson's world, there was one strategist and many pieces. The placement of the pawn transformed an act of discipline into a permanent psychological imprint. From that moment forward, the story no longer belonged to Reggie alone. It belonged to everyone who worked under Bumpy's command. That small red stone pawn became the message that cemented Bumpy Johnson's untouchability. It represented power exercised without noise, authority expressed without explanation. Unlike public executions or violent purges, the pawn spoke quietly, yet its meaning echoed endlessly. It communicated that Bumpy operated in a brutal world, but he was not governed by impulse. His decisions followed logic, hierarchy, and long-term calculation. The pawn was simultaneously a warning, a signature, and a declaration of method. It announced that punishment would always be proportionate, deliberate, and irreversible. More importantly, it redefined the relationship between leader and subordinate. The symbol clarified roles with unsettling precision. There was no illusion of equality, no pretense of partnership. Everyone beneath Bumpy existed within the structure of his design. As long as they moved correctly, the game continued. The moment they betrayed the game itself, removal was automatic. This clarity reduced chaos within the organization. People no longer tested boundaries out of curiosity or greed. The risk was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a color, and a story attached to it. The philosophical weight of the red pawn elevated the incident beyond ordinary criminal discipline. It introduced a form of psychological warfare that relied on meaning rather than repetition. Bumpy Johnson did not need to constantly assert dominance because the symbol did it for him. His men understood that he saw the entire board, not just individual moves. This perception created a form of reverence that went beyond fear. They did not merely obey him, they believed in the inevitability of his judgment. In their eyes, Bumpy was not reacting to events, but anticipating them. That belief changed behavior at every level of the organization. Decisions were made more cautiously. Loyalty became instinctive rather than enforced. The pawn suggested that betrayal was not just dangerous, but foolish. It implied that anyone arrogant enough to test the system had already misunderstood their place within it. This psychological elevation is what transformed Bumpy from a crime boss into a mythic figure. Myths are sustained not by constant action, but by shared belief. The red pawn became a tangible artifact of that belief, a reminder that power rooted in intelligence outlasts power rooted solely in violence. In the end, the story of Reggie's mistake endured not because of what was done to him, but because of what was understood afterward. The pawn crystallized Bumpy Johnson's philosophy of control into a single, unforgettable image. It declared that leadership was not about proximity, friendship, or shared profit, but about structure and order. Those who accepted their role and performed it loyally had security, protection, and continuity. Those who betrayed the system ceased to exist within it. This binary simplicity made Bumpy's rule remarkably stable. He rarely needed to repeat the lesson because it had been taught perfectly the first time. His followers moved through their roles with the quiet discipline of people who knew the rules were real and permanent. That is why this episode occupies such a central place in his legend. It demonstrates that the most effective displays of power are not the loudest or most violent, but the most precise. The red pawn remains a symbol of that truth, a small object carrying an immense warning, proving that in Bumpy Johnson's world, the game was always under control, and he was the only true player. The strategic impact of Reggie's punishment was immediate and profound, going far beyond the act itself. From that moment on, a culture of absolute loyalty was established within Bumpy Johnson's organization. It wasn't just fear, but understanding. Everyone came to understand that trust wasn't an operational detail, but the central axis upon which the entire empire rested. The story of Reggie, Thorne, and the Red Pawn quickly ceased to be just an internal episode and came to occupy an almost ritualistic place in the organization's collective memory. It was told not as an explicit threat, but as a silent warning. Reggie's mistake demonstrated that individual greed was seen as a structural flaw, something that jeopardized everyone's balance. Therefore, the fear of repeating that mistake outweighed any temptation to deviate. The result was a more disciplined internal system, in which each member understood exactly the weight of their choices. The punishment not only corrected an immediate problem, but redefined future behavior, creating an environment where loyalty was no longer negotiable. Over time, the story solidified as the founding myth of the organization's finance department. The episode of the Red Pawn came to symbolize not only punishment, but the logic that governed Bumpy Johnson's entire power structure. Every accountant, every operator, and every intermediary knew that this symbol represented constant vigilance and inevitable consequences. The efficiency of the financial operation grew precisely because the margin for deviations was psychologically eliminated before it even existed in practice. Honesty, even if forced at the beginning, became a habit. The organization began to function as a cohesive organism in which each part understood that harming the whole inevitably meant its own destruction. This environment allowed Bumpy's empire to grow in a stable and predictable way, something rare in that universe. While other structures crumbled under the weight of internal betrayals, his strengthened. By definitively eliminating his first major internal threat, Bumpy not only solved a specific problem, but immunized his organization against future attempts at betrayal, creating a system that self-regulated through fear and respect. The red chess piece then became one of the most powerful symbols ever associated with Bumpy Johnson's name. Its meaning was clear to everyone, but it never needed explaining. Its mere mention was enough to immediately stifle any intention of internal theft. Most impressively, after that episode, Bumpy never again needed to make a public example related to financial misconduct. The lesson had been definitively learned. This demonstrated the effectiveness of a carefully thought-out punishment, not based on excessive violence but on symbolic precision. Reggie's punishment was not merely physical or material, it was psychological and collective. He created a shared memory that functioned as a permanent control mechanism. In this sense, Bumpy's power proved less dependent on brute force and more on the construction of lasting meanings. Fear existed, but it was accompanied by clarity. Everyone knew exactly what the rules were and why they existed. This predictability transformed the organization into an extremely efficient machine, where internal discipline replaced the need for constant vigilance. The conclusion of this narrative serves as a testament to the power of intelligence and symbolism in maintaining authority. Reggie Thorne's story isn't just about theft or internal corruption, it's about the violation of a pact considered sacred. By betraying Bumpy's trust, Reggie threatened the very logic that kept the empire functioning. The response that followed was brilliant precisely because it wasn't impulsive. It was calculated to teach, not just to punish. Bumpy Johnson made it clear that the greatest threat to any power structure doesn't come from external enemies, but from within. Internal betrayals silently corrode what external force could never destroy. Understanding this, he transformed loyalty into the existential foundation of his organization. It wasn't a moral choice or a subjective expectation. It was a condition for existing within that system. Those who accepted this rule remained. Those who broke it ceased to be part of it definitively. This clarity eliminated ambiguities and strengthened internal control in an almost invisible way. Perhaps Bumpy Johnson's greatest achievement as a leader wasn't the punishment itself, but the order that arose from it. He built such a well-defined system that punishment became unnecessary in the future. When rules are understood at a deep level, obedience ceases to be forced and becomes automatic. This is the kind of power that transcends the underworld and finds an echo in any enduring leadership structure. The story of the Red Pawn demonstrates that true authority doesn't depend on the constant repetition of violence, but on the creation of unquestionable principles. Bumpy managed to engrave such a fundamental rule in the psyche of his empire that it began to apply itself without needing reinforcement. This balance between fear, respect, and intelligence is what guaranteed the longevity of his organization. The lesson left by this episode goes beyond the criminal context and reveals a universal truth. Strong systems are not sustained solely by force, but by the internalization of clear limits. When this happens, power remains even in silence.